Idaho, came back to the valley to visit his former church. And there he presented a sermon that he had a question about why it took 4,000 years for Jesus to come and die for us. Why at that time? And, there are several things that I thought about why that might be so. I'm thinking of the verses there where Paul writes there in Galatians. Galatians 4:4, we're told that Jesus came in the fullness of time. In Ephesians 1:7-10, you're reading where his death also came during the fullness of time. In Romans 5:6, he says that he died at the right time. Well, this is interesting because we need to ask the question, why was that the right time? And why wasn't there another? Why couldn't it have come earlier? There are several things I'm thinking of. As pre-flood, of course, we know that the flood was caused by the region of the Nephilim. And so we have total rebellion there. And it's hard to bring in the gospel at that time that would go to the ends of the earth. Then after the flood, we have in Genesis 11, the building of the Tower of Babel. And there all the nations of the earth had gathered to build this tower in this city and to make a name for themselves, not put God's name into the world. So in essence, God had no nation to put his name in the world. And so he had to do that. And he began with a man. And that's why we see at the end of chapter 11 of Genesis the introduction to Abram, who would later be Abraham. Because by beginning with a man that he calls from the land of Ur, the area of the Chaldeans, he forms a nation, Israel, and from that nation calls the whole world. And so there's a progress there. When we see God's relationship to us, it's not just in the context of you obey my laws and we're good to go, but it's in the relational covenant aspect. God is relational. It's not a black and white, do this and you're in. And we realize that there's nothing we can do to be in, nothing we can do to commend ourselves to God. The only thing, as I've said before, that we can commend to God is our great need, that we're sinners. So God's relationship with his people and the restoration has to do in relationship. In fact, covenant, the whole story of covenant, from the time of the fall in the garden in Genesis 3:15, where we get the promise of the prolonged war, where God will bring out the seed of the woman who will deal the death blow to the serpent, all the way down to the end, to the last book. We have this promise of God restoring all things, this idea of covenant that grows through across time. And when I look at the time periods and what's going on, when God has begun to call a nation by calling Abram, it's been about 2,000 years since creation, using Ussher's chronology. And then from the time of Abram, or Abraham, to the time of Christ is another 2,000 years. And of course, from the time of Calvary to now, it's another 2,000 years. And so it's interesting that we see this pattern that flows through Scripture as God builds across time. There are several things that I think of when Jesus came at the time he did, was during what's called the Pax Romana. This is the time of peace, the creation of roads, the ability for God's people to go forth and carry the message into the world as never before. And so this is the right time, it seems, to bring the message forth. And what was going on in Israel? It's captivity by Rome at that time. They're looking for the Messiah. The Messiahs were very high on their list. Many Messiahs were showing up. And so this was a time when things were beginning to really rumble about their deliverance from all the bondage that they've been through. Remember, they've been through the Egyptian bondage, and they were freed from that and set to their land. They were attacked by the Assyrians, and the whole northern kingdom had been dispersed. They were attacked by Nebuchadnezzar there in Judah and held prisoners and captive for all those years, those 70 plus years. And then after that, we have the Grecian empires come in. We have, and of course, the great Antiochus Antiochus IV, and his persecution of the Jews. And then we have Rome come in. And Rome just simply walks in and takes charge. they had very little peace across that time. And when we look at their mandate, which was to be the light to the world, we find they were really more interested in being like the other nations around them, and that they really never fulfilled their mandate. And so here we have them now in context of this last group of people, the Romans, who have them in bonds, not being free, and they're looking for the Messiah to come. And in their minds, all they see is that the Messiah will come and deliver them from whatever current bondage they happen to be in, and set up this great eternal kingdom, and just show the Jews for how great they really are, that all the nations will be the path to the throne of God there in Jerusalem. But they had some wrong concepts about what the Advent and what Christ was coming to do. And we might have the same problems when we think about the second coming. We think we know what the second coming is going to be like, and we have these ideas about what it's going to be, and when it actually happens, it may be very different than what we thought. And so we have to be careful that in our own ideas about our own expectations, that we don't end up missing what was important for us to know here at the end when Christ shows up. So here he is at this time in world history, when he's able to actually go out into a multicultural world and present the message of the cross, where the church began to grow there in the early centuries. I noticed that the message of the cross isn't just something that can be given once, or just given at a certain short period of time and then it's done. We think about the gospel and how central it is to the message of Christianity. That if you're a Christian, Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 15, it's the foundation of everything you believe. It's by which you stand on if you continue to believe and haven't believed in vain. It's our everything. And Paul tells us there in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 2, he says, I vow to know nothing among you save Jesus Christ and his cross. And so it's very important that we see what's happened over the 2,000 years of Christianity, because for that time period, the gospel hadn't always had such a clear tone, such a clear ring to it. And so this is something that is not just bringing the gospel and Jesus dying for us, but it's about the struggle that man is going through over this period of time to choose who he will worship, because that's the central issue, not just of the book of Revelation, but across all time. Who will you worship? This is the Elijah question on Mount Carmel, when he stands before the people and says, how long will you halt between two ideas about who God is? And this is the same question we're asking at the end. It's across all time. And the gospel is the message that goes forth to woo the heart, not to rule the heart. Though we want it to rule, we want to obey the gospel. But it calls us to Jesus Christ and what he had done for us, and that there is the solution to our problem and all the things that are going wrong. So maybe it is at the right time he died for us. You can't be as certain. There's other questions, but looking at the general history of mankind and the development of ideas, the development of his people, as he began to bring the nation of Israel forth, who were to be the light to the world, it seems to be that was a very important time, that the world itself was ready to begin to receive Christ. And the way the things were set up, people could begin to go forth with the message of salvation outside of Judaism, into the greater world, into the world of the Goyim, the Gentiles, and bring the message of Christ. So maybe that was at the right time. The right time, Christ died for us. Blessings.